Hi everyone and welcome to this new video. In this video we continue the Active Directory Exploitation series. Specifically in this video we will introduce a lot of different concepts that are critical to understand when it comes to Active Directory Exploitation. So the objective of this course is to showcase the main enumeration and exploitation techniques when it comes to Active Directory. And to do that, we need to understand exactly what is Active Directory, what are the main components of Active Directory, and so in this video we will analyze such components. And here I made a list of the most important components of Active Directory to keep in mind, like what are domain controllers, GPOs, organizational unit, LDAP, Kerberos, and things of the sort. And then we will talk about the difference between domains, trees, forests, and the concept of trust. So as always, I hope the video will be useful and enjoyable. If you have any feedback, leave it in the comments, subscribe to the channel, share this video and this series with like-minded people to help me grow. And that's it, enjoy the video. So Active Directory, often abbreviated with AD, is a service developed by Microsoft for managing and organizing the resources within a network, such as user, computers, and other devices. It provides a centralized way to manage and secure large-scale ET environments. So you have to think of Active Directory not in a small network with just 2-3 computers, but you have to think about big networks, like corporate networks that have hundreds and hundreds of different computers with specific hierarchies where each business is a little bit different than the other, so that's the idea. Now, Active Directory has a lot of different services. The core ones are as follows. It deals with authentication. So when we're talking about authentication, we are talking about verifying user identities through many different means, the simplest of which is user credential such as username and password. But of course, user credentials are not the only way to validate identities. There are many different ways, for example, with certificates and things of the sort. So with Active Directory, we're able to authenticate user to the Active Directory network, and we're able to assign specific roles to those users. Then we find, of course, the concept of authorization, the service of authorization. And the idea is that, of course, you want to ensure that, okay, you are authenticated, you are able to access the domain. However, you access the domain with a specific role, with a specific set of permissions, with a specific group memberships. So that's the idea. With authorization, it is all about ensuring that users have the right permissions to access the right resources. So each resource is protected by a set of permission, and the users can or cannot have those permissions, and authorization is about verifying this. It's like making sure that if you access a resource, then you are authorized by the Active Directory network to access that resource. Now, when you consider authentication and authorization, these services are also present in a basic Windows operating system. So there's nothing special in them. What changes in Windows Active Directory is the way they are implemented. Because when you move from a local computer to a network of computers, of course, you must use different protocols. You must use, for example, network protocols for authentication. And as we will see, Kerberos is the main protocol that is used for authenticating users to the Active Directory. So there's like a completely different set of protocols between the local version of Windows and the Active Directory version of Windows. And of course, the Active Directory is more complex because there we are talking about a network protocol. So we're talking about communicating with different computers with a series of messages and things of the sort. Now, while authentication and authorization are critical services that are needed to have a secure system, because without these you cannot have a secure system, the main purpose of Active Directory is actually the directory services. And this is like a general term to refer to all the different ways in which Active Directory allows to organize and to manage network resources and access policies in a centralized directory. And the key idea of Active Directory is that it can be adapted to support many different services and technologies. And here I mention just a list. For example, the certificate services, abbreviated as ADCS, which have to do with the usage of TLS certificate, so the certificate we use to authenticate the server in the web. These specifically are X509 certificates, and so with this kind of thing, with this kind of services, you can set up an entire centralized authority infrastructure, CA infrastructure, within Active Directory, so that you can authenticate the server and clients through these certificates. So very useful in certain context. And there are many different things you can explore much more. Of course, our focus here will be on enumeration and exploitation. So, since Active Directory is an extremely complex system that is made up of multiple components interacting with each other, it is important to understand the role of each component and generally what is its purpose. And here I put together a simple list of the most important components. This is by far not a complete list. It is a list of the things that you must know if you want to enumerate and if you want to exploit a basic Active Directory setup. But of course, consider this just a start because there's so much more to explore, and in this series we will explore it together. So in this video, essentially the idea is to go through each of those components and discuss what it is they do and what is their purpose. Let's start with the domain controllers. So domain controllers are a fundamental part of Active Directory. They are used for so many different tasks, including user authentication, storing the Active Directory data, managing and enforcing security policies, processing of directory queries. You can imagine domain controllers as the main protagonist of Active Directory, because everything that happens in a domain controller, one way or another, essentially. Sometimes things do not happen in a domain controller, but even in those moments, a domain controller earlier in the interaction did something, essentially, that allowed other parties to communicate, to authenticate, and things of the sort. So domain controllers are essentially the point of control within an Active Directory network. Now, in small networks, you might have one domain controller, and then you have other nodes. In a bigger network, you might have multiple domain controllers, so DC01, DC02, DC03. So essentially, you're not always bound to have one domain controller. You can have multiple of them, and actually they can help to provide redundancy and load balancing. Since they have to process the directory queries, having multiple domain controllers, maybe in specific geographical areas, can help to reduce the load, essentially. And the idea is that these domain controllers, they replicate the data among themselves, so that even if one of them fails, the information regarding Active Directory is not lost. Now, this is a key point to understand. So, what is the information on Active Directory? Well, essentially, it is the set of policies, for example, they make up the directory, which we will see in a bit. It is the set of users. It is all the metadata regarding the computers, right? The servers, the policies that act on the service and things of the sort. So an Active Directory network is just much more than the single connection. It's actually this set of metadata, which can be really, really huge. Now, when you lose a domain controller, you don't want to lose all the metadata regarding the Active Directory, because to set up a different domain controller is actually quite easy. However, to recover the data if you lost it, it can be extremely painful and expensive to recreate a big Active Directory configuration. So this is why you must have multiple domain controllers. In big networks, there are multiples typically. Now, the domain admins is just a group of Active Directory. Members of this group have root privileges over the specific domain. That is, they can manage the domain, they can do change configuration, they can update the domain. That is, they have complete control over the domain and can change the domain configuration and security settings. Now, for example, here I am in the Active Directory in the domain controller that we set up in the first video, and currently I'm logged as the administrator of the machine. Here, if I say who am I am the xstamp/administrator. Now, when we're working in an Active Directory environment, we have to consider that we have the local users and the local groups, and then we have the AD users and AD groups. And AD is a structure on top of local, So actually it should be thought of like this. But essentially, for example, if we want to check what are the local groups, we say, for example, net user, and here we get the users of this local machine. If we instead do net user / domain, we get the members of the domain. Now, in this case, as you can see, they are the same members because we are working with a domain controller. So this machine is specific for Active Directory. If we were, however, in a workstation, we would see two different things here. Now, if we do the same for group, so net groups, here we see all the groups of Active Directory, but technically we should have done /domain. So in a general computer, you have to do net group /domain to get access to the domain information. So in this case, it would be the groups that belong to the domain. Now, as you can see here, there are a bunch of different groups, including domain admins, domain computers, domain controllers, domain guests, domain users, and things of the sort. Now, if we check our user, for example, if I say who am I /groups, you will see essentially that here I belong to the domain admins. So I belong to the set of user who is a domain admin and therefore who can manage the domain, because I am the built-in administrator of a domain controller. So in this case, we are talking about a specific case in which I am the local administrator of a domain controller and therefore I am domain admin. But you can also be domain admin if you are a general user of the domain. You do not need to be the local administrator of a workstation or a server. The most important thing is that in the context of Active Directory, if you execute whoami /groups, you get the domain admin, so you are assigned to this kind of group. And this is another way of seeing it, that if we do net user administrator, we get the information about the administrator user, and at the end of the command of the output, we get a list of local group memberships and a list of global group memberships. So local refers to the local machine, so to everything that happens in the local machine, while global refers to the Active Directory domain. And in general, in the context of Active Directory, it is critical to keep in mind this distinction. You will always have a reality local to the machine and a reality that belongs to the Active Directory portion, when of course the machine is joined to an Active Directory network. So for example, in the domain controller, which is this machine, I belong to the, if I check the users local and the users of the domain, I get the same results. If however I go into the workstation and I do net user, so these are the local accounts for this particular machine. I get quickemu, I get administrator, I do not get the user Leo. However, I am logged as the user Leo. And the idea is that this user belongs to the Active Directory domain. So to access this information, I have to do net user -domain. And now notice this thing. I get Leo, I get Kerberos, which is the Kerberos component, we will see. And then I have the domain, the administrator for the Active Directory domain. So in that case would be the domain admin essentially. So that's the idea. Notice that here we get different information. Now, here I said that domain admins have root privileges over a specific domain. Now, is there a group that has more privilege than domain admin? Actually, yes. And this group is called enterprise admins. They have control over an entire forest, which you can think of a set of Active Directory domains. And we will talk about this towards the end of the video. But the idea is that enterprise admin is even more powerful than domain admin, because domain admin has control over one domain. Enterprise admin has control over an entire forest. So now we can talk about group policy objects, which is one of the most important concepts of Active Directory. So group policy is a feature that allows administrators to define settings and to enforce policies across users and computers in an Active Directory domain. Now, group policy objects are a collection of settings that define how various aspects of the network environment should behave. So, group policy is the general abstract feature. When you have to set a new policy, you're working with group policy objects, with the GPOs. And here you can see some list of policies, some example of policies, but before doing that, to edit these GPOs, you can use the group policy management feature and specifically the GPMC console, which allows you to create, manage, and apply GPOs to different parts of the Active Directory structure. How do you access it? Very simple. you go to the domain controller, you press window plus R, and then you write gpmc.msc. So you go here, window plus R, here I do gpmc.msc. So this is the group policy management console. Here we can see the forest, which only contains the xstamp.lab domain. Here you can see the site, there are no sites here. We have just one domain, the xstamp.lab, and here we can find the different policies. We have the default domain policy, and we have the xstamp.lab policy. And if we edit it, essentially we can change it, computer configuration and user configuration. For example, if I click on this xstamp.lab policy, first of all, we can see that this policy is applied to authenticated user of the domain, which means that if you authenticate to the domain, then the policies that I've written in this GPO, in this group policy object, will be applied also to your user. And if you check into, for example, settings here, we can see a bunch of general things, and we can see, for example, that we have disable turn off real-time protection. I mean, we have disabled real-time protection, so we have enabled turn off real-time protection. We're also disabled configure automatic updates. So these are practical examples of policies that are applied across the domain. It means that a machine, if you join a machine this domain, then the user will have turn off real-time protection through a GPO, through a group policy object. And of course, you can do a lot of things with this policy because they really allow you a fine-grained control over the environment. So here I click on edit, I do policies, administrative templates, I do Windows components, and here I have access to all the internal stuff of Windows, how it behaves, camera. I can allow the use of camera or I can disallow the use of camera. I can disable the use of camera. These policy settings allow the use of camera devices on the machine. So things of the sort. It's really, really powerful. And after all, this is why corporations use it to manage their internal networks. So this is a first example of the directory services offered by Active Directory. Now, let's say that you made a change to these policies. Well, the idea is that GPOs are updated during the regular policy refresh interval, which typically is around 90 minutes, but of course you can configure this interval. However, if you want to push the change immediately, you can call this command gpu update/force. And this essentially will force the update so that the latest policy you have on your domain controller will be pushed to all the different machines. So that's the idea. Now let's go back. So here's some example. Password policies, so forcing users to use complex password or forcing a password expiration date, which to be honest, I don't really like, but that's a different thing. You can still do it. User rights assignment, so defining which users or group can log on locally or shut down the system. So maybe you want that a certain user can only log on certain machines, but not on other. So you can define this with the GPOs. You can also restrict the software, so control which application can be executed on domain join system, and of course security options. So account lockout policies, like after you put the wrong password 5 times, your account is locked and you need to ask support to unlock it. Then the fact that the support can unlock your specific account, maybe how Kerberos is configured, we will talk about Kerberos and things of the sort. I mean, you really have a lot of power with Active Directory. It's all about understanding exactly what you need and finding the right policies for your need. Now the GPOs are applied at different levels. So they can be applied on the level of a single computer, so a local policy. They can be applied on the level of a site, which is a geographical location or a network segment. So it's like something that is smaller than a domain. They can be applied to a domain, so all system within a domain. They can also be applied to an organizational unit, which we will talk about them now. So these are specific group or collection of system and users within the Active Directory structure. And it is also possible to apply a group policy object to specific groups using security filtering. And an example of this, we saw it right here, because this policy is applied through security filtering to the authenticated users. And here I can add another group. So I don't know, domain admins or the people who can print documents in domain, things of the sort. I can create a new group. For example, I could create an HR group and make sure that the policy, the HR policy, is only applied to people belonging to the HR group. Of course, this is done so that it allows you to apply the policy not on the level of an organizational unit, but maybe you apply it domain-wise, but then you filter it out with respect to a single group. So there are, complex ways of selecting to which user and which system the policy is going to be applied to. But in general, with these policies, you can do a lot of stuff. So now we can talk about organizational units, abbreviated as OUs. So OUs are containers within a domain used to organize the objects, users, computers, and groups. They can be used when structuring an Active Directory so as to reflect the organization needs and hierarchy. So the idea is that most organizations are structured hierarchically. So maybe you have groups together that handles different subsystems, and then you have other like managers or like HR groups or like technicians. So you typically have this kind of, hierarchical structures. And the idea is that with these organizational units, they are containers of Active Directory objects that you can use to model such things. So that's the idea. Now to create a new organizational unit, you can use the Active Directory Users and Computers tool, the ADUC tool. You press, this time you have to write dsa.msc. So Windows+R, dsa.msc. And here you have a different example of what it means to work with an Active Directory. So this is a different system. In this system, we are dealing with Active Directory users and computers. So here we have the saved query, which there are no items to show. And then here we find the xdump.lab domain with a bunch of different folders here. And we have these employees, which if we do properties, essentially, this is an organizational unit. And for example, in this view, we can see that we have a bunch of different folders. We have all the different computers, which in this case is this other quick ammo. We have the built-in like security groups. We have the users, so administrator, the user Leo. We have these employees, which is an empty organizational unit, and we have these domain controllers, which contains the DC01, which is this server, and it is the only domain controller. For example, if you want to create a new organizational unit, name, I don't know, subscribers, then what I do is I right click here, I say new, I do organizational unit down here, I write the name, subscribers, I can protect or not protect from accidental deletion. And here, for example, I've created this organizational unit named subscriber. And then here I can say, for example, new, I can say user, I can say the first name, test, I can say the user logon test, password 123 exclamation mark. And for example, I just do this. And here I created a new user named test. And this test, I can check the various stuff about this. This is a member of domain users. And now if I go into net user /domain, I also get the user test. So this is basically the idea. With this, we can manage users and computers. Now, there are different advantages in using organizational units. With this kind of system, it is possible to implement an access control based on roles, as organizational unit can act as security boundaries, allowing to implement the least privilege principle. For example, I can create like a baseline organizational unit with just basic permissions, then a more advanced one, then an even more advanced one. So the idea of the least privilege principle is that you only should assign privileges depending on what you need to do with that specific user, with that specific object. If a user here has to access normal resources, he or she will never have to do like authorize actions that require higher privileges, then you should put it into a basic organizational unit, give some basic permission to this unit, and that's it. So that's the idea. And when you apply a GPO to a specific organizational unit, this overrides the typical domain level policies. So this can be used for deep customization. And finally, of course, they can be organized in a hierarchical structure. So there is a concept of inheritance. So if I have the parent organizational unit, so the children inherit from the parent, and you can create a structure like this. This can become, of course, complex, like object-oriented programming, but in certain cases, especially for like corporate context in which things do not really change fast. So once you have the basic structure, it's gonna last for a lot of time. So it's a good investment to do it once at the start. Once you have that, it's just some maintenance and you are good. That's the idea. And also, if you are listening, all these kind of things are features that Windows implemented for corporate networks. So basically that's the idea. Active Directory is used to manage corporate networks. So when you do red teaming, you always have to think of a corporate network. So the next item on the list is LDAP, which stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, LDAP is the protocol used to query and interact with the directory services that store information about the Active Directory. I mean, here, of course, we use graphical interfaces, for example, in these users and computers, and in the policy editor. But generally, if you want to do it through a command line tool, you use LDAP or you use interfaces over LDAP. Now, LDAP is a general protocol, so it is standardized, it lives outside of Active Directory. However, within the context of Active Directory, LDAP allows clients and administrators to access and manage the information of an Active Directory network. Because of course, there's a lot of metadata with all these policies, with all the relationship between groups and users. So to manage this information, LDAP can be used. So it can be used for authentication and authorization, for directory browsing, and for like administrative tasks over the domain. Now, queries in LDAP looks as follows with these parentheses, and this like, for example, object class user, some account name equal Leo. And to execute this query, which just retrieves an Active Directory user from the domain, we can do this. We can do import module Active Directory in a PowerShell, like here. So we do import module Active Directory, and then we can say get ID user LDAP filter. So we put a filter on this basic like function, and the filter filters for all the users that are called Leo, that have the same account name to Leo. And if we execute this, we get the object GUID, we get the seed, we get a lot of metadata regarding the user. And also we notice that this user has a principal name, a user principal name. And we can also do this with the test user that we just created. So we have this test@xnump.lab. So essentially that's true. And so essentially this is the idea. With the LDAP we can filter out the data. So this is a small example. So now we can talk about Kerberos. So specifically, okay, Kerberos is a network protocol, okay, but specifically Kerberos is a network authentication protocol. So the objective of Kerberos is to authenticate users, to authenticate stuff. So it provides a secure method for authentication using a centralized server. And of course, in the context of Active Directory, the central server here is going to be the domain controller, clearly. Now, Kerberos is a ticket-based authentication system that uses a trusted third party known as the Key Distribution Center, KDC, to verify the identity of users and services within the network. Now, in the context of AD, the KDC is implemented as part of the domain controller, which means that it is built in. It is a process that a domain controller has running on it. It is a service that the domain controller exposes to the people in the Active Directory, to the users and machine in Active Directory. And the objective of this service, of this KDC, is responsible for authenticated users and issuing tickets that are used to access the resources of the domain. Now, in this video, I will not go in depth over Kerberos because I will make a specific video on that. However, the main idea is that with Kerberos, we have the KDC, we have the user, and we have a service. So basically, the idea is that the users first initiates an authentication with the KDC to obtain a ticket. This ticket is then issued to Kerberos to obtain a different ticket, which is then used to the service to obtain access to the service. So here we have different tickets. We have so-called golden tickets and we have silver tickets. We will analyze this much more in depth. But for this video, I just want to mention that there is this protocol that happens for authenticating user that is also used for giving users access to specific services. That is, this service will use the ticket given to the user to check if the user is properly authenticated and also if it is authorized to access that service. So it is used for authentication and authorization. Now, user accounts in Active Directory are linked to Kerberos principal, where in Kerberos, a principal is an identity that can be authenticated. Each principal has a unique name and Kerberos issues tickets to this principal. For example, if you want to see the Kerberos tickets associated with your user, you can run the following command: klist tickets. So very simple, we go here, klist tickets, and we check this. So we obtain the ticket for the administrator service. So essentially that's the idea. So continuing, we find the NTDS.dit. Now this is a critical file because it contains the core database where all the information about the Active Directory is stored. This is the acronym. It stands for New Technology Directory Services, Directory Information Tree. Very verbose. We don't care about the name. We care about the fact that since it contains the entire structure of the domain, it includes the domain settings, the security policies, the password hashes of the users, and the replication data needed for multiple domain controllers. Usually it is stored in a specific directory within the domain controller. For example, in the context of this domain, but this is the default one anyways, it's in C, Windows, NTDS. So we go here, we open the file explorer, we go into C, Windows, and we search for NTDS, and we have this NTDS.dit, so this file, which of course is a critical file because it contains a lot of sensitive data. Continuing, we find the SYSVOL. Now SYSVOL, which stands for System Volume, is a shared folder on domain controllers in Active Directory that stores and replicates important system data across all domain controllers in a domain. For example, earlier we talked about the GPOs. And the idea is that when we are in a domain controller and we are modifying a policy object, a GPO, this thing is going to propagate throughout the network. This change is going to propagate throughout the network. And to propagate this change, the SYSVOL system is used. So the shared folder is used to propagate this thing. And this is why this share contains the GPO files, essentially. So the SYSVOL volume must be consistently replicated across domain controllers to ensure uniform application of policies and scripts. So changes made in this directory are replicated across domain controllers using different technologies depending on the version of the Windows server. Could either be file replication service or distributed file system replication. We don't really care about that. What we care about is that, once again, this can contain sensitive data, so we must be careful about it. And finally, for this first list of components of Active Directory, we find the global catalog, which is a distributed data store in AD that contains a partial replica of every object in the forest. So this is done for optimization to help searching across all the domains. It's not too important, however, I just wanted to mention because it is part of Active Directory and it reminds us of the fact that Active Directory is a system that is replicated across all domain controllers. So with this, we have closed the main components of Active Directory. So as I said, this is not the entire list, of course. This is just the most important thing that I want to get across in this first episode to start getting used to Active Directory. So we have the concept of domain controllers, which are the server which control the domain. We have the domain admins instead, which are the groups, so the users essentially that have privileges over the domain controllers, so they can do stuff with the domain. They can configure the policies and things of the sort. We have the policy themselves, which is one of the main reasons why corporate use Active Directory. We have organizational units, which allow to organize users, groups, and computers into hierarchical structure and to apply specific policies to specific groups. And then we have the LDAP protocol, the Kerberos protocol, and a bunch of other things to make the entire Active Directory work. So these are the most important components. Now, to finish this first video, I want to talk about domain, forest, and trust, because a domain is not the end. So we don't just have domains. Domains can actually be connected with each other. So there is an important distinction in Active Directory between domains, trees, and forest. So a domain, you can think of a domain as an atom in the context of Active Directory. So the least you can have is an Active Directory domain. So with a domain controller, with one or more domain controllers, with a series of users, workstation, and things of the sort. Now, what happens if you have more than one domain? What happens if you have domain 1 and domain 2? Well, the idea is that this domain can be connected with each other, so they can form connection. And depending on the connection they form, you can either have trees or forest. So specifically, you have a tree when you have a collection of domains that are connected in a structure using a contiguous namespace. So it means that the domain share a common root domain. So we start from a root, and then the domains are specialization of that root. So all domains within the tree are linked together using a trust relationship and share a common namespace. So for example, in this case, we might have the root domain, which is the root here, examp.lab. Then we have the domain 1.examp.lab and then the domain 2.examp.lab. So we are these things that are connected with a common domain. And so specifically, this means that all domains within a tree are part of the same DNS domain structure. So examp, then we have a subdomain, domain 1, domain 2. Now the forest instead, so a forest is the highest level of the AD hierarchy and represents the entire directory structure. So the idea is that a forest can contain one or more domains, but all domains within a forest share a common scheme and a global catalog, GC. Each forest has at least one domain, and domains within a forest can be part of a trust relationship, not necessarily, allowing users from one domain to access resources in another. So, and here there are two images, one that signals a tree, so this is like an example of a tree, and the other which is an example of a forest. So this is a forest because we have a tree. Now this tree exam.lab is connected to an entire different Active Directory test.com, and of course this connection form so-called trust relationships, which is the final part of this video. Now the idea of trust has to do with the fact that domains can be linked with each other, and when a domain is linked to another, this is called a trust relationship. So of course this kind of relationship can be configured to be in different ways. So there are different types of trust: two-way trust, one-way trust, external trust, forest trust. So the idea is that trust are ways to establish relationships between different AD domains or AD forest. So they allow, for example, user in one domain to access resources in another domain, simplifying cross-domain authentication and resource sharing while still putting like security boundaries. So this is it for this video. We introduced the main components that I want you right now to know regarding Active Directory. It was a lot of stuff, but in the future video, we will understand much more in depth the components of interest and how to enumerate them and exploit them. As always, I hope the video was enjoyable. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, share this video with like-minded people to help me grow. And that's it, to the next video of the series.